Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic development. This program is part of that effort. So today we're going to be discussing the riots in France. It's a big story. It's everywhere. The French police shot a 17-year-old French of Algerian and Moroccan descent. And the initial story that came out was that the boy did not stop when flagged to stop. But then there was a video which clearly showed that that was not the case. Now, this rioting has once again put a spotlight on what are called banlieues, the suburbs of French cities. But these aren't rich suburbs. These are the poorest neighborhoods and generally now labeled as priority quarters and are home to more than 5 million people. Many are either immigrants or third or fourth generation French. There are multiple takes on why such riots happen. Some argue that the violence is the result of poverty and discrimination, entrenched social ills. Those on the conservative side say the rioting is mainly a law and order issue. Gangs and petty criminals taking advantage of such incidents to create mayhem. Still others, especially sociologists, have tried to trace it to France's policy of secularity, which requires immigrants to undergo a cultural rebirth of sorts, a total assimilation, if you will, into the host society. Cultures, norms, and mores. Many analyses have tried to look into France's policy of integration and Britain's multiculturalism that seeks to integrate immigrants but understands the desirability of their own values. In the case of French of Algerian descent, there are also the bitter memories of Algerian War of Independence and the Paris massacre of 1961 when the French National Police attacked and killed Algerian protesters in Paris. Regardless of which line one takes, one thing is obvious. Long-standing tensions and grievances feed a dispiriting cycle. So what happens is that each tragedy triggers an explosion of violence, which then begets the police response and which then results in further mistrust and violence. So to try and make sense of what's happening, why violence flares up every few years. Well, the last big episode was in 2005. And what can be done to address the problem? I have with me Alexis Poulin, who's the founder of Le Monde Moderne Media. Alexis is a journalist, expert in EU affairs, and has worked for NGOs and public institutions. With him is Yasser Louati, a French political analyst and human rights advocate based in Paris. Yasser is currently heading the Committee for Justice and Liberties, which is a transnational human rights and civil liberties organization. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being on the program. It's a very important issue, and we thought that it's important to get the take of those who are there on the ground and understand what's happening in order for our viewers to also get a perspective on why these things happen. I mean, we all watch films on Netflix and Primetime and the rest of it, and there are lots of French films that have actually looked at this discrimination and the rest of it. But let me begin with Alexis here. Alexis, there's a long story of sorts, especially when it comes to Algerians, French Algerians. We also know that when the War of Independence was going on, French left, like Sartre and others, were talking about French repression. There were others like Camus who had a more sort of nuanced take in the sense because he was a Pied Noir himself. He was opposed to the FLN violence also. He was opposed to the French state's oppression also. So all of this is basically very complex. And I refer to this because there's a historical background. And if we just take a snapshot view of what's happening, probably we'll not be able to understand why things happen in the way that they do. I'm not saying that there are not other issues more modern, but there's also a memory of sorts. Would you agree with me there?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the Algerian independence war is a big issue in France, and it has never been really taken for serious by the politician. There is in France racism, and when you talk about racism in the police forces, the answer of the authorities is that it doesn't exist. Even if the UN, even if many NGOs are actually saying that France has an issue with systemic racism, the answer of the authorities and Emmanuel Macron government and the head of the police forces in Paris is no, there is no issue in the police forces about racism. And when you look at it, there has been numerous history of violence against Algerian, but also North African people that are living in France. And the whole issue here is now about people saying that kids from parents that came from North Africa are not well integrated, and so it doesn't work because they feel more from North Africa than from France. Even a French senator, Bruno Retailleau, said that the kids were turning back to their origin, even it was talking about race origin or something like that. And what we've seen in the last few days was an outburst of racism and racist slurs from politicians, which is very worrying because it tells a lot about the untold in France about systematic racism and racism in politics. We had a candidate, for example, in the last presidential election called Éric Zemmour, and Éric Zemmour clearly is anti-Islam and has this kind of speech that is focusing on North African people and people coming from North African parents, saying that they can't be French, they don't have to be French, and they should need to go back to North Africa. Well, the main issue is that these speeches have become kind of mainstream, and now we are here. And what happened in the suburbs with the death of Nahel? He was just 17-year-old, killed by a policeman without any legal frame in the way he used his gun, is that these kids, their parents, they have enough. They say, we have the French citizenship, but we have not been treated as equal for years. And I think this is a very important part of the riots, of the revolts that we've seen, but it's been mostly unanswered by the French president and his government.
Right. I think that's a very good beginning to position this discussion. Since you mentioned the issue of religion, Yasser, if I were to pull you in, and you are in a way straddling two worlds, and with your background, cultural norms, mores, and of course your citizenship of France. I don't know how long your family has been in France, but obviously you're there, you're working. So there's a sort of straddling of the two worlds. Now, because Alexis mentioned Islam, and I had mentioned the 2005 riots, it was very interesting because I was following the story then. And two of the French writers that I have for a very long time been a reader of, Gilles Keppel and Olivier Roy. And it was interesting that while Roy was arguing that this is not about religion, these grievances are rooted in multiple other issues, Keppel was arguing the exact opposite. So just give me a sense of how you look at this.
Well, I'm going to quote again what was said back in 2005 when the same uprisings took place following the death of Zied and Bouna in Clichy-sous-Bois. Instead of taking a look at the social roots of the problem and how institutions have failed these populations for decades, as a matter of fact, we have had multiple episodes where grassroots organizing try to take on the political establishment with more or less success, if not failure. Instead of taking a look at that and say this is a social problem we have to deal with, they had to ethnicize, Islamize the issue. It's not about society failing and being stratified, a socioeconomic order that does not benefit the masses and puts these minorities under a very tense situation. No, they are rioting because they are Muslims, they are rioting because they are blacks, because they are Arabs. A famous writer, since you mentioned French writers, Alain Finkielkraut, speaking to Haaretz right in the midst of the 2005 uprisings, spoke of ethnic riots, meaning that there was a complete dismissal of what led to these uprisings. Now, we do not hear, for example, the ethnic or religious question when white people rise and even organize riots. We saw it with the organizing of the Yellow Vest movement, crushed in blood by the Macron administration. It was a class question, but the racial question was never put into question. Now, fast forward to what is happening today. This is a way of dismissing again the rules that have led to these events, and for the political establishment to kind of say this is not our problem. This is something coming from outside of our, let's say, mainstream culture. Just to give you a few examples of that, Emmanuel Macron and through his ministers blamed the social media, blamed the parents, but did not blame the policies that led to these events. We have to remember that when you're black and Arab, even when you are not organizing or let alone rioting, when you are black or Arab in France, you are 20 times more likely of being stopped by the police. Add factoring the fact that this police is the deadliest police force in continental Europe. As a matter of fact, if you compare Germany and France, in Germany, one person was killed in the last 10 years for a traffic stop. In France, it's 13, and for the past year alone. You add again the fact that within the police force, the main unions like Alliance Police, for example, are closer to the hard right, if not the far right. And the reaction of this union actually tells us a lot about how power is structured around the police. Alliance Police published a press release just 2 days after Nahel's death, and they said, quote unquote, "We are at war with these undesirables. This is not an action. This is not time for a union, a political action. It is a time for war." And then they continued by threatening the government, telling them, either you acknowledge the situation or we'll take the matter in our own hands. And this is why, even though things are apparently starting to calm down, unfortunately, we will have more Nahels in the future. And unfortunately, we are going to have even more uprisings. Why? Because the structures that led to the killing of Nahel, the way we saw it, are still there. The police is poorly trained. The recruitment of the police, the bar is very low. I'm going to just end on these few figures to give a sense of that any fool can be a policeman or woman in France. Back in 2012, 1 out of 50 candidates would make it through the police admission test. Today, it's 1 out of 5. The grade to be admitted was brought down to 8 out of 20, which means 40% as a marking, as a score at the exam. Add to it, so you have poorly fit people recruited. Training was slashed from 12 to 8 months. Even police instructors complained that once these people get hired, they are intellectually, physically unfit, and we cannot get rid of them. So, and maybe one last, and this is, I might be a bit provocative, but the historical question to me is extremely important. The police was never purged from its racist elements. You mentioned the 1961.
Alexis also agreed with that. I mean, Alexis did say that the historical perspective is very important. You've got to take exactly longer trajectory of this.
And that's why it's like we keep carrying these massive burdens, and everybody's trying to dismiss them that don't exist. First, the French police as we know it today, with the Police Nationale, the highly centralized police force that we know it today, was founded by Maréchal Pétain in April 1941. Now you can say this was a long time ago, this doesn't matter. Yes, it does, because the fascist elements that were there at the genesis of the police that succeeded in deporting Jews in 1942 and then killing Algerians in 1961, these elements were never purged. One man can summarize that. Maurice Papon was in the police in 1942 to deport Jews. He was then head of the police.
1961, exactly. He was the head of the police.
So who armed the policeman? Who trained him? Who led him to believe he could kill a youngster point blank in the heart and get away with it? Well, the answer lies in history and the institution in of itself.
Absolutely no. So now we have a real problem here, Alexi, because Yasser used the term minority. Now, here's the thing. On the one hand, you decide that in terms of the French model of integration, that there has to be the element of secularity, which actually creates the French singularity. On the other hand, even after 4 generations, if an Arab or a Berber or someone from North Africa or a black, French, if he or she is still a minority, then we've got a huge problem there. Because, and Yasser also talked about the Yellow Vest movement. In fact, I would fast forward closer to that, the pension protests. Now, if the white French can riot, pillage, and vandalize, but it's not because they are Christian or it's not because they're white, so there is no religious element tied to that, there is no element of race tied to that. Why is it? And I think that's where we have to go into history once again, that when it comes to, and I said that this is a dispiriting cycle, because there are grievances, an incident happens, the police responds in a certain way, and that kind of keeps the cycle going on. So, Alexi, given that you have such keen insights into this, please tell me that Yasser is wrong when he says that more Nahils will unfortunately get killed. Or please don't tell me that he's right.
Sadly, I don't see any decision in a sense that the police will be regulated. You have to know something about the policeman that killed Nael. He had issue. He was arrested and he had issue about sexual exhibition earlier this year in January. The police also has some corrupt elements. So if the power and Emmanuel Macron's government doesn't want to do anything with the police, because without the police is dead. It doesn't exist in France. All his ruling is about police violence, police forces. So he doesn't want to even start a reflection on corruption, on racism in the police forces. So since these people are in power position, nothing will change. And even worse than that, I think they will give a sort of a white page, blank page for any police officer saying, you're right, do whatever you want because you're the unions, you decide, and we'll protect you, which is exactly what happened for years. 2 weeks before the death of Nael, a young guy, 19-year-old, was killed in the same condition in the south of France. But there was no camera at the time. So no one talked about this guy. No one talked about him. He died, and the police gave a testimony saying that he was a danger, so he had to shoot. If there was no camera, the police made a false testimony saying that Nael was driving on the policeman, which was false. Yeah. So everything is there to actually push the kids on the street and say, we can't bear that anymore. But the answer of the power and of the government of Emmanuel Macron is nothing to see here. Keep on going. The police forces are great. There is no racism. There is no violence. And you are a dangerous bunch of sauvage or whatever they use. It is a disgrace, to be honest. And
but Alexis, sorry, I'm intervening this, but I want to sort of understand this. You have said that Macron is basically in power because of the coercive apparatus of the state.
He stays in power since right? He used the police forces.
Yeah. Yes. Now, here's the thing. We also have politicians like Marine Le Pen, right? And last time, when she came pretty close in the runoff, everyone was talking about Macron as being the bulwark against this far-right politician.
Yeah.
Now, if now Macron is also primarily dependent on the coercive power of the police, then frankly, I mean, as a Pakistani, perhaps I should not say this. I mean, my own country has a number of problems, but that doesn't really look good for France.
No, it is terrible for France. You're right. And the world should know what is happening right now, because not only is the police forces used for violence and repressions, even for political opponents, as you said, for the pension reform, for example. There was no looting at the time. It was just a union protest. And yet we've seen violence like we've never seen before. For ecological organization, les Soulèvements de la Terre, which has been cancelled by the government as well, which is a sort of civil movement for ecology. And now we have in the parliament laws that are being voted to allow the police forces to listen in any phones and open cameras of every phones, even journalist phones in France, plus drones, plus the use of any data cameras and techno surveillance apparatus. So what is happening in France is very, very bad. It's terrible for French liberties, for people, and it's terrible because the debate is turning into a racist debate or a kind of pre-Civil War, us versus them. Either you support the police, or if you don't support the police, you're not a good citizen and you're with the rioters and you should be cancelled. There is something very, very dark right now in the French political debate. And I think it's showing because I've been doing a lot of shows and talking in English in many countries. People are trying to understand what is happening in France. Well, I'm telling you what is happening in France is that Macron is turning the Republic into a fascist regime. Surely, but clearly.
That's disturbing to hear. But Yasser, since you're looking at the situation, you've got lots of statistics also. Just a quick question before a follow-up one. What is the percentage of North African or Arab French men and women in the security services, especially the police?
Well, in France, we do not collect ethnic data nor provide ethnical statistics, so it's very difficult to come up with a clear figure as you would have, for example, in Anglo-Saxon country, more specifically in the US, for example. So in France, there is this taboo because you're supposed to be a universal republic. And the last time France counted people on the basis of their ethnicity / religious affiliation, it was with the Jews, and it ended up badly for them with a near well-accomplished genocide. When it comes, however, to the police force, there are, of course, many individuals who are members of the force at different ranks who are of post-colonial and colonial descent. But just a couple of years ago, there was a famous paper where these police servicemen and women complained of racism within the police, and they complained about their own colleagues seeing them first as blacks and Arabs and not their colleagues, or at least their comrades serving with the uniform. Now, to again pinpoint how things are turning badly with this dysfunctional police, we mentioned about its genesis and the fact that the government is too scared to deal with it, that now the majority unions are closer to Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour than they are to the center-left, center-right, or at least, just to be more vague, mainstream politics. We have, of course, as has been said right before me, the emergence of a police state in France. But the emergence of this police state in France couldn't have been done or rendered possible without racism, because the government could not attack the majority population at first. It had to target minorities with the usual discourse. These are troublesome elements. We have the suspect community, and we need extraordinary laws to crack down on these, blacks, Arabs, the banlieue, the Muslims against, gangsters, terrorism, etc. And where the majority of the population bears the responsibility is when it remained quiet while the government was depriving these minorities of their basic human rights. Just almost 10 years ago, in 2015, we had the passing of the mass surveillance bill, which was adopted almost, with an absolute majority despite the Snowden revelations a couple of years prior. And this bill allowed the government to collect all of our online information, to siphon our browsing data without going before the judge. We had in 2017 the passing of the permanent state of emergency, which made all the extraordinary measures of the state of emergency like
And sorry, I just want to clarify. So these legislations have not been protested. I mean, people haven't the court hasn't anyone gone to the court challenge these
there have
legislations?
been no there have been challenges by civil society organizations and very limited demonstrations, but we have not seen a massive, how can I say, uprising against what was becoming obvious, the government becoming ever more challenged, having a narrower and narrower popular basis. I do agree the police is protecting the regime and keeping it shielded from the anger in the streets. This police now is dictating the policies to be passed. So you have a law allowing mass surveillance, a permanent state of emergency. In 2017, the definition of self-defense for the police was broadened by the left-wing government of Hollande. And this, self-defense under Article 435-1 said, if you do not stop at a traffic stop, the police can shoot you. Now, of course, they said in case of absolute necessity, in case the policeman is in danger. However, the police adopted a very loose interpretation, and that's why we saw an explosion of killing of people at traffic stops. Now,
so we've got two problems here. One is the legislation. One is the police culture that has evolved over many decades. And thirdly, the general racism in society. And all of that sort of concentrated at that traffic stop on that unfortunate day when Nile was shot and killed. Yeah, go ahead, Yasser, but I'm also heading towards the closing of the program, but I want you to finish the point that you were making.
Well, so now, of course, if you are just a little bit informed about, basic politics and the way hard right, if not far right ideology is dictating the evolution of legislation, we cannot say that France is rightly a functioning democracy. Even Dominique de Villepin, who is not, an anarchist who wants to dismantle the republic, a week and a half ago spoke of illiberal democracy when it comes to France. So that is why what is happening today, and I'm sorry to say, what the majority of white people are discovering in terms of shutting down of organizations, Soulèvement de la Terre among them, the cases of police brutality, all of that was prepared by using the banlieue and ethnic minorities as the laboratories and the guinea pigs of this repression. And that is why today we cannot say a reform of the police is possible or that politicians will do their job. The French Republic the Fifth Republic as we know it, is a failed experiment, and France does need a new constitution, a new reorganization of powers, and especially in case of our country that has a long monarchical tradition, we need stronger checks and balances. The executive branch of power cannot be let loose as it is today.
Wow, those are very strong words, I must say. But I perfectly understand where you're coming from. But Alexis, here's the irony. When I asked Yasser about the ethnic makeup of the police forces, he said that this data is almost impossible to gather because the French approach is towards universalism, and it's about, liberty, equality, fraternity. And yet, despite that, we are obviously facing a huge problem. We are also, as I said earlier, that, it's politically speaking, if the choice is going to be between Macron and his government, as the two of you gentlemen have put to me, and someone like Marine Le Pen, then I'm saying that the choices are not just limited, it becomes a Hobson's choice. It's like no choice at all. So, having said that, since I'm heading towards the closing of the program also, I want to end up on some kind of optimistic note. And I want you and then Yasser also to give me some hope that something can be done to correct this.
The optimist note is that the French population is not dumb and is not racist. 7 out of 10 French people agree that there is systematic racism in the police forces in France. And so if politicians and those in power are in denial and are lying and don't want to address the issue, the French people are very well aware of what is happening. And most of French people don't want a civil war and respect Muslim people in their faith and the way they live in France. And a lot of people are actually propose some solution on the left side of the political spectrum, of course. Now, one of the main issues we have in France is also the ownership of main media. It's billionaires that are buying some media, being the press, TV station, radio, and they use it as a way to manipulate the debate or organize the debate in a sense that will make sure that their business will not be it, and they will decide who's the next president, to make it short. So we lack a lot of independent media saying what is real and what is happening, and that if you look at France as a whole and French citizens, they don't want this violence. They don't want these racist people being elected. They don't need that, and they don't want that. And there is a lot of people that actually show on the ground that we can live in a good harmony and without this violence. And what we're lacking right now is peace and respect.
Right. Yasser, last word to you. How do you think this can be worked out? Because there is also this argument, and it's also portrayed, in films and in TV series about these priority quarters, almost like ghettos. People are saying, well, successive French governments have put in like more than, 50 billion euros over the years to try and figure out how to provide services and the rest of it. And yet there are these gangs, and then these gangs perpetrate violence, and then the police responds, and so on and so forth. So there is that argument also. I want you to, just like Alexis said, that the majority of French people are not racist. And so there is hope there. And he's also said that parties on the left side have actually proposed certain solutions. Do you believe that this could actually become a major issue in terms of the electoral success or failure of those parties and politicians that have brought France to this pass?
Well, it's really hard to tell. If you and I could predict the future, we would be in a much more comfortable place right now. However, the dynamics of politics right now in France is that the center of gravity of French politics is to the right, if not the far right. And as I said earlier, we do, of course, lack a more diversified media landscape, which allows for various voices to express themselves. But we also lack the political involvement of the people who disagree with this political project. So what we're seeing today is big money is buying the media and pressuring politicians.
Well, that's what Alexis also said,
to veer towards the hard right, if not the far right. At the same time, we also need to see a wake-up call among the overall majority of French people who disagree with this kind of politics, not only to vote when it's time to vote, but also to pressure their own elected officials. Oftentimes what happens, people get elected, but they do not get checked by the people who voted for them. And that is extremely important. The organizing, of course, at the grassroots level has to be a little bit more diversified. We have seen a fragmentation of civil society over the past 10, 15 years. Now, this fragmentation needs to end and be more or less heading towards in the same direction. It is extremely important to note that when people speak of will Marine Le Pen win in 2027, the question is almost irrelevant because the ideas she is preaching are being picked up by mainstream politics. So much so that Gérald Darmanin, Minister of Interior for Emmanuel Macron, accused Marine Le Pen of being, quote unquote, too soft, not on Islamism, but on Islam. And the situation is so bad that even the cronies of Emmanuel Macron are speaking of a third mandate for him. That's how much they feel that they don't have to answer the French population, and they can even change the constitution for Macron to run for a third mandate. Now the responsibility lies on us as citizens to question what has caused the defeats of the past, let's say, 20 years in terms of socioeconomic policies, racism, and institutional reform, but also for civil society to get its act together. Macron has shut down an environmental organization because it was questioning the economic policies destroying the environment. So now we see that before it was only the blacks and Arabs and Muslims, now we see white organizations. And I tell people who are not part of this, yesterday you were quiet when it was the other today is you. So now, honestly, I think there is a responsibility on citizens, and that cannot be minimized.
That's how it starts. Gentlemen, I have completely failed to end this on an optimistic note. I really wanted to. And, before I close, just a personal experience. I mean, there was for 3 years, this was 99 through 2001, I was doing a project for Bohl Stiftung. So I used to go to Berlin very often. And this was the pre-Europe period. And I used to often, not always, but often route myself through Paris. And I fell in love with that city. Although my basic handicap was and still is that, I didn't speak French. And I remember at that time, I usually could not take the underground because the machines did not have the option of multiple languages. And every time I would ask a Parisian for directions, he would kind of look at me and essentially saying, well, you're in Paris and you might as well learn French. But it's a beautiful city with so much art. And, I have long been a great votary of French literature. So, it really pains me to see that a country like France, which in many ways has been the apogee of art and literature and culture, and where most of those writers and artists in Europe who were exiled would come to Paris, and Paris was the real hub of art and literature. So unfortunately, as I said, I've not been able to finish it at an optimistic note, but I will stay in touch with both of you, and I will draw from your insights in trying to understand the situation. And I really, really hope that France basically bucks the trend of ethno-nationalist sort of sentiments, which we are witnessing in Italy, which we're witnessing in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. And as I said before the program, and I was talking to both of you, the world is kind of, going in the wrong direction in so many ways. Mm-hmm. But thank you so much once again for being on the program. I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, as far as the views are concerned, this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button that helps us bring you quality discussion. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.